Well, to focus some more on that story, we're joined by our correspondent Mariam Saleh, who's with us from Al Ain in northern Bekaa. Also joining us from the Lebanese capital, Beirut, we have Mohammed Obeid, who's a political analyst. Welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mariam, who is in Al Ain, where the fuel shipment was arriving just moments ago when we spoke to you. Mariam, what's going on?
Well, only a few moments ago, we saw the fourth and final batch of tankers for today. And they have, it's not clear whether you can see it behind me. Perhaps the cameraman could give us a closer look. That was one of the final tankers that is trying to make its way into the Al Ain town. Deep inside, we know that there are stations where these truckloads will be emptied in order to later on be taken to the several areas across the country and to be distributed depending on the demands, of course, of the markets and the needs of the various institutions. So therefore, for today, we have around over actually 65 tankers. We are told that there are more tankers in Syria right now waiting to come into Lebanon, but perhaps this will not probably happen today. It could probably happen another day. And this is only just the first vessel of shipment that came from the Islamic Republic of Iran. And we are expecting to learn about the arrival of the second ship, which will also contain diesel, which is necessary for electricity here in Lebanon. The third ship is expected to contain gasoline, which is also a very significant necessity for the country. Now, as you know, Lebanon is in a crippling crisis, especially when it comes to fuel, because fuel has been clearly one of the main sources of necessities. As you know, hospitals are in dire need of fuel in order to generate electricity. You have the municipalities, we have the homes, the elderly homes, the orphanages, and several other institutions, in addition to the schools. And they're also very much afraid of the situation that they will not be able to bring in students on time in the school year, because most of the schools have their own private electricity generators that need diesel, and this is the main fuel that is being provided today by Hezbollah. Now, Hezbollah's Secretary General Said Hassan Nasrallah has said previously in his final speech, very clearly outlining how Hezbollah will generally be distributing this diesel, especially the first batch. Hezbollah has already broadcasted several phone numbers in several areas, mainly through the Al Amana petroleum company, which is, by the way, blacklisted by the U.S. Sanctions. They will be the main side responsible for the distribution, since they already have that expertise. And Sayyid Nasrallah made it clear that all this fuel is not in any way for profits. It's not for any sort of gains, even on the political level. And the main proof for that is Sayyid Nasrallah said that this is for all Lebanese, and they opened the door to all companies, all institutions who want to buy this fuel for a price that is less perhaps than the market price, because Sayyid Nasrallah said it will be sold for under the cost, the original cost of all this fuel. So basically, finding a general sense of a way that does not, as they said, embarrass the Lebanese government. Hezbollah decided to empty this shipment in a Syrian port in Banyas instead of bringing it to one of the Lebanese ports. And this is something people were not sure about just before this. So now it's clear that none of the ships, it seems, will be arriving to any of the Beirut ports. They will be arriving into Syria, and from Syria they will come into Lebanon. We saw today all of these trucks with Syrian license plates, and this is probably the first time since the beginning of the Syrian war that we have that many Syrian vehicles enter Lebanon so clearly, officially, although we do not have an official stance from the government. But this is in itself breaking the Caesar Act that was enforced by the United States against the Syrian government, and we saw clearly that Syrian government is ready to cooperate in any way that is necessary for Lebanon, despite the fact that Syria itself is under shortage of fuel because of the U.S. occupation as well. So this is on one side actually breaking the Caesar Act and sanctions against Syria, but it's also breaking the sanctions, the U.S. unilateral sanctions against the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the, if we may say, non-definite or clear U.S. sanctions against Lebanon. And we saw or we heard from closed doors from politicians saying that the U.S. had actually threatened Lebanese officials on the fact that if this fuel does reach Lebanon, that there will be action. It seems the action that was taken by the U.S. was not negative. It seems it was actually action that tried to safeguard any sort of, if we may say, it's U.S. allies here in Lebanon, trying to show that the U.S. can still help Lebanon, despite the fact that this is too late, too little by all Lebanese. It was considered something that was proof that the U.S. was the main side that stood in the face of Lebanon from getting any sort of assistance from the from its Arab neighbors, or its any ties with the Arab states like Egypt, like bringing in gasoline, which was an act that Lebanon wanted more than 3 years ago. They wanted to bring in gas from Egypt through Jordan and through pipelines, of course, from Syria into Lebanon, which would have really assisted the Lebanese electricity crisis. Also, Hezbollah Secretary General Said Hassan Nasrallah has stressed that a huge portion of this fuel will be donated to those institutions that need it most. We're talking about public hospitals, orphanages, elderly homes, the Lebanese Red Cross, even poor municipalities that do not have enough to be able to buy that diesel and use it for necessities such as bringing in water from territorial waters. But even when it is sold to other institutions like the private hospitals, and other institutions, it's not going to be sold for a very high price. So that in itself is very significant. This proves that Hezbollah has been adamant on bringing in this assistance for all of Lebanon, not just a specific group.
Okay, stay with us, Mariam. Let's cross over now to Mr. Mohammed Obaid, who's in the Lebanese capital, Beirut. Mr. Obaid, I have two questions for you. First of all, give us your thoughts on the significance of this fuel aid that has now reached Lebanon from Iran. And the second question is, amidst this fuel and energy crisis and the economic crisis that Lebanon is going through, how come no Arab country has offered assistance to Lebanon to alleviate some of the pressure that the nation is experiencing?
Well, first of all, sure, there is an American siege in the first place, which explains the case of the answer to the two questions. Now, as for the siege, it was asserted in several ways, blocking the money from coming into Lebanon, also urging the U.S. administration to urge its allies to take out all the dollars and all the hard currency from Lebanon in order to suffocate the country as a part of the economic sanctions that were undeclared but were in action at the same time. The people in the street felt all this because the banks who are also part of the tools of the Americans. The banking sector in Lebanon is known to be in good ties with the Americans and always fearing them in order to avoid the Americans taking action against them in international banking system. So you have people not being able to take even from their money accounts in the banks. So this was also part of the overall pressure that was exerted on all the people. At the medical level, you have no medicine. At the industrial level, you cannot have manufacturing factories producing anything because you have no diesel oil. So the whole country was facing, as your reporter said, a crippling crisis because it's tied to energy. Everything is tied to gas and for the cars and for the vehicles, for diesel, for the factories, for the power plants, the local power plants, that generators that produce electricity to the people, houses. So at all levels, and this step was essential, was more than extraordinary or dramatic in the sense it was a shift in this frozen scene that was created by the Americans and their allies, and proving to them that we are people that are able to break the siege, we are able to challenge you, we are able to take the steps that are needed in order to protect ourselves and provide ourselves with the substantial needs. So at all levels, this was really a historic step at this time, because the sanctions against Hezbollah were not created yesterday or the last year. They have been going on for over 30 years, and Hezbollah was managing its ways and avoiding any obstacles that would harm Hezbollah. So they turned into harming the people of Hezbollah, and within that aim or that goal, they did not mind harming the whole Lebanese people. And this was really the change this time. Everybody was being pressured. The whole country was being pressured. As for the second part of your question, that why the Arab countries did not send any aid, any fuel or something, because unfortunately they were part of this plan, because they get orders from the Americans, and whatever the Americans say, they would say, okay, now you have this issue of the gas, natural gas, that is to be piped from Egypt through Jordan and Syria. This project was created in 2009, but still everything was frozen because of American orders. And things were even opened a little bit because of the shipment of the diesel oil from the Islamic Republic of Iran. The American ambassador immediately, the same day, declared that they will allow the gas to be shipped through pipes from Egypt via Jordan and Syria to Lebanon. So this proves, on the one hand, that the Americans were the real part, and they are admitting this, that they were part of the siege. And second, the logical conclusion of all this is that the Arab countries, who are always under the American protection and orders, would never do anything that the Americans would not agree. So that's why they were not sending any money, any dollars, any aid, any fuel as well. So this is the whole story, and this what was broken today with this step that was made. And thankfully, which is really the Lebanese gratitude to this, is to the Islamic Republic of Iran, to Hezbollah, and to the Syrian Arab Republic. So you have here a step that broke and dismantled all the plans that were created by the Americans and were implemented through the past 2 years.
Mariam, one last question for you. Let's turn our attention to the round after round of U.S. sanctions. These sanctions have been called an act of aggression against all of Lebanon. The question is, why is the U.S. applying the pressure on all of Lebanon when the nation is obviously suffering?
Well, as your guest said, these U.S. sanctions are not new. We saw them actually in an ascending mode, and we saw them begin by actually blacklisting many of the figures here in Lebanon. They blacklisted whether members of Hezbollah and non-members of Hezbollah, just allies of Hezbollah, and one of them is actually the main Christian ally of the Free Patriotic Movement, member and head of the Free Patriotic Movement, Gibran Bassil. They were some of the main sides that are blacklisted by the U.S. because of their support and their backing of the resistance. And you have several issues that play out on the reason why the U.S. is doing this. One of the thing is the maritime border negotiations. As you know, there have been negotiations that were previously conducted through mediation between, of course, the Israeli side and Lebanese side do not directly negotiate. So therefore, there's United Nations, the interim forces always in the middle trying to negotiate and bring in talks between both sides on the issues of maritime borders. The U.S. has been pressuring Lebanon to give up some of the blocks in those areas. And that has been one of the main reasons why the U.S. does not want to assist Lebanon and wants to enforce more pressure on Lebanon. It began through that political if we may say, blacklisting considering these sides as supporters of the resistance, but they did not consider them as supporters of the resistance in their blacklisting. They did it under the pretext of corruption, while as you very well know, and most analysts are stressing, that there are many Lebanese politicians that are friends of the U.S. that have not been blacklisted, and they are the main corrupt sides. And we're talking about many of the groups that have been in power for over 3 decades now. They have been the main sides that have been the result of this mismanagement and corruption in the country, and the reason behind this this corruption and this debt on Lebanon, and still they have not been blacklisted. So therefore, here we can tell that basically those that were blacklisted by the U.S. were allies of Hezbollah only, and that is on one side because they are allies of Hezbollah, and also because they refused to give in to the conditions of the Israelis when it came to the maritime borders. As you know, experts have said that Lebanon's waters contains a vast resources of natural gas and hydrogen and even petroleum. So that in itself is something the U.S. wants to remove from Lebanon. And as Israel has a long history of theft of Lebanon's natural resources, whether it's soil or water, now with the fact that Lebanon can drill its own natural resources, they are trying to take that away from Lebanon, and this is what the resistance has said on and on. We've heard it from Hezbollah Secretary General. He has even threatened the Israelis if they come anywhere near to the borders that Lebanon considers its maritime borders, based on United Nations maps, then therefore they will retaliate against the Israelis. So you have several issues that the resistance has stopped the Israelis on doing. So therefore, the U.S. is trying to use that card of putting pressure on Lebanon. They said the political card. Then they went to the economic card, which started after 17th of October 2019, although the protests of that point began as popular protests. However, they were taken advantage of. They were taken to being politicized and used by several of the groups, especially those that are allied with the U.S. And we saw this clearly right now when you see many of those officials that are allied with the U.S., call themselves friends of the U.S. They have removed their funds from Lebanon. They have even confiscated and stockpiled millions of tons of fuel, also in a matter that Lebanese people cannot get to. So that in itself is proof that the U.S. allies in Lebanon have been taking part in these sanctions, in these U.S. sanctions. So that is the many folds. You also have, as your guest mentioned, the medicine crisis, the crisis in the hospitals. What we were seeing as something that will be close to a humanitarian crisis is something that Hezbollah, through this fuel, will be able to fix, at least for the moment. Of course, Hezbollah did say that they are not going to be the only solution. There should be other solutions, which we hope to see through the new cabinet. And that in itself, many people are saying, is the blessing of this initiative by Hezbollah. The fact that Hezbollah has decided to bring in this all this assistance has actually pushed the Lebanese politicians to form a cabinet as soon as possible, because they say they want reforms. They say they want international acceptance as a government in order to be able to bring in more funds for the country and to find some solutions. But what we are seeing right now, this is a historic point in the history of Lebanon, what many consider something equal to perhaps the victory of the 2006 war and against Israel. Yes.
Thanks a lot to our guest for this segment of the program. Mariam Saleh, correspondent, joining us from Al Ain in northern Bekaa. Also, thanks to political analyst Mohammed Obeid, speaking to us from the Lebanese capital, Beirut.